book of Deuteronomy starts in a most unusual way. Within a few verses, God speaks to the Israelite nation and says, "Right, you've been here quite long enough, time to move on." Obviously, I'm paraphrasing. They've been camping at Mount Horeb for about a year, and though they were reasonably happy and comfortable, this wasn't the promised land. God wanted them to claim his promise. The Israelites were in their comfort zone. They had received manna and quail and felt safe and secure. But it wasn't where God wanted them to be. Immediately we see a lesson for us. There is a danger relaxing in comfort rather than striving to be at the centre of God's will. God never intended us to stand still, and he didn't want that for his people here either. He told them clearly it was time to move on. It wasn't that they didn't want to go to the promised land, but there were serious obstacles to overcome before they could reach their destiny. God didn't just say go, he said, go to the mount of the Amorites. The Amorites, enemies of the Israelites in a land where giants lived. And to be where God wanted them to be, they would face battles and challenges. The book then moves on to a lengthy message that will turn out to be the very last sermon that Moses gives to the Israelites. This is about a month before his death. Moses starts with incredibly encouraging words, stating that as long as the people did what God wanted them to do, God would take care of them, no matter where their wanderings would take them. But if they would be unfaithful, there would be nothing but misery. However, he then states the impossibility of natural man taking hold on and keeping divine privileges. He also gives a clear description of the promised land, which includes the modern-day Jordan, Syria, and even Iraq, at least as far as the Euphrates River. In his first scripture sermon, that quoted in Matthew chapter 4, our Lord quoted from Deuteronomy 3 times. The New Testament refers to Deuteronomy more than 50 times, a number exceeded only by Psalms and Isaiah. Deuteronomy also contains the first statement of that greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Underlying everything in Deuteronomy is Israel's covenant with the one true God. Everything in the book flows from the statement in chapter 5, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. The Israelites are commanded to remember 4 things: God's faithfulness, God's holiness, God's blessing, and God's warnings. The first 3 chapters recap the journey from Egypt. Chapter 4 is a call to obedience, to be faithful to the God who was faithful to them. After that is a repetition of the law, including a repetition of the 10 Commandments. There are also laws concerning sacrifices and special days, and other laws for the new generation. Blessings are promised to those who obey, and famine is promised to those who break the law. In the wilderness, the people's fear led them to a failure to trust God. As a result, they rebel against God's plan for them to enter the land that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God had brought Israel out of slavery in Egypt, given the law at Mount Sinai, and brought the people to the borders of the promised land. Fear leads to disobedience, that leads to severe punishment. Because of this disobedience, the Israelites living at the time were barred from entering the promised land. Not one of this evil generation, shall see the good land that I swore to give to your ancestors. The only exceptions are Caleb and Joshua, the only members of the scouting expedition who encouraged the Israelites to obey God's command. Moses himself is barred from entering the land due to a different act of disobedience. He is punished for his lack of faith, which underlines his disobedience. God told him, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Moses passes from a contemplation of what the Lord has done to a challenge to keep the law of Jehovah. The divine manifestations of grace laid Israel under the obligation to a conscientious observance of the law, that they might continue to enjoy the blessings of the covenant. The challenge starts with the appeal to hear and keep the commandments without adding to them or taking from them. For not only were life and death dependent on their observance, but it was in keeping the law that the wisdom and greatness of Israel was confirmed. Jehovah then, through Moses, warned strongly against idolatry, the worship of images or idol deities. He then gives promise of restoration as a consequence of repentance and sincere conversion. Moses reminded the Israelites again of the glorious miracles of divine grace performed in connection with the choice and deliverance of Israel, such as had never been heard of from the beginning of the world. The rise of this nation was quite different from the origin of all other nations. None ever heard the voice of God as they did, much less speaking such words as they heard. Israel was made to see all of this, that it might know that Jehovah was God, and there was none else beside him. He shows the reason why God did these miracles, that he is the only living and true God, and there is no other. The Israelites were to know and lay it to heart that Jehovah alone was God. He was God in heaven and on earth. They were to keep his commandments, in order that it might be well with them and their descendants, and they might live long in Canaan. All his laws, moral, ceremonial, and judicial, were an obligation, because he is the Lord God in heaven and on earth. He has the right to command, and ought to be obeyed. It is odd that both we and they are more apt to obeying the law of the land made by man than following God's laws and standards. God promises rewards, not for their merits, but to encourage them, and to assure them that their labour will not be lost. God himself is the lawgiver, and only when we are obedient in adhering to his laws, the promise comes that everything will be well with us, and with our children, and our days will be prolonged. In the wilderness, Israel's abandoned trust in God arises not only from fear, but also from success. Moses tells the people that success is likely to breed a spiritual complacency far more dangerous than failure. He says, when you have had children and children's children and become complacent in the land, if you act corruptly by making an idol in the form of anything, you will soon utterly perish from the land. In the wake of success, people stop fearing God and begin to believe success is a birthright. Instead of gratitude, we start to have a sense of entitlement. Success for which we strive is not wrong, but it can be a moral danger. The truth is that the success we achieve is mixed from skill and hard work, combined with fortunate circumstances and the common grace of God. Success is not permanent. It doesn't satisfy. Only in God can we find true security and satisfaction. It may be surprising that the result of complacency is not atheism, but idolatry. Moses foresees that if the people abandon the Lord, they will not become spiritual free agents. They will bind themselves to objects of wood and stone that neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. Perhaps in Moses' day the idea of a religionless existence did not occur to anyone. But the worship of God becomes replaced by the human made fabrications to worship. If we remember that God's grace, God's word, and God's guidance are at the root of whatever success we have, then we can be grateful rather than complacent. The success we experience could then honour God and bring us joy. Moses reiterates the Ten Commandments in a passage which is virtually identical to the initial record in Exodus, but with a couple of noteworthy changes. The first commandment reminds us that everything in the Torah flows from the love we have for God, which is a response to the love he has for us. This love was demonstrated by God's deliverance of Israel out of the house of slavery in Egypt. Nothing else in life should concern us more than our desire to love and be loved by God. If we do have some other concern stronger to us than our love for God, it is not so much that we're breaking God's rules, but that we are not really in a relationship with God. The other concern, whether it's money, power, security, recognition, sex, or anything else, has become our God. This false God will have its own commandments at odds with God's, and we will inevitably violate the Torah as we comply with this God's requirements. Observing the Ten Commandments is conceivable only for those who start by worshipping no other God than Yahweh. The second commandment raises the issue of idolatry. Idols are gods of our own creation, gods that we feel will give us what we want. In ancient times, idolatry took the form of worshipping physical objects. Idolatry begins when we place our trust and hope in these things more than in God. The third commandment literally prohibits God's people from making wrongful use of the name of God. The issue of the Sabbath is a complex one, not only in the books of Deuteronomy, Exodus, and the Old Testament, but also in Christian theology and practice. Nonetheless, the general principle of the Sabbath applies directly. The first part of the fourth commandment calls for stopping work for 1 day in 7. This was an incomparable gift to the people of Israel, but it required an extraordinary trust in God's provision. Israel had to trust God not to let a day of rest lead to economic or military catastrophe. In Deuteronomy, the commandment is extended so that you cannot force slaves to work on the Sabbath, so that your male or female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. A reminder was also added so that your ability to rest securely in the midst of military and economic competition from other nations is a gift from God, who protects Israel with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. In Exodus, the Sabbath is rooted in the 6 days of creation, followed by a day of rest. Deuteronomy adds the element of God's redemption. The Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath holy. Bringing the two together, we see that the foundations for keeping the Sabbath are both the way that God made us and the way that he redeems us. The fifth commandment says that we must respect the most basic authority among human beings, that of parents for children. To put it another way, parenting children is among the most important kinds of work there are in the world, and it deserves and requires the greatest respect. There are many ways to honour or dishonour your father and mother. Jesus stated that by obeying this commandment requires working to provide for your parents. We honour people by working for their good. This fifth commandment comes with a promise, again not present in the Exodus account. that your days may be long, and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Through the proper honour of parents, children learn proper respect in every other kind of relationship. In Commandment 6, murder isn't the only form of violence, it's the most extreme. But Jesus said that even anger is a violation of the sixth commandment. As Paul later stated, we may not be able to prevent the feeling of anger, but we can learn how to cope with our anger. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Married people should not have sex with people other than their spouses. Anything that erodes the bonds of marriage infringes the seventh commandment. Stealing is a violation of proper work because it dispossesses the victim of the fruits of his or her labour. The eighth commandment tells us that no society can thrive when property rights are violated with impunity. The ninth commandment honours the rights to one's own reputation. Although stated in courtroom language, the ninth commandment also applies to a broad range of situations that touch practically every aspect of life. We should never say or do anything that misrepresents somebody else. The 10th commandment prohibits coveting or desperately wanting anything that belongs to your neighbour. It is not wrong to notice the things that belong to our neighbours, nor even to desire to obtain such things for ourselves legitimately. Coveting happens when someone sees the prosperity, achievements, or talents of another, and then resents it, or wants to take it, or wants to punish the successful person. It is the harm to another person, your neighbour, not the desire to have something, that is prohibited. Here again, the ultimate grounding of this commandment is the command to worship God alone. If God is the focus of our worship, desire for him displaces all unholy, covetous desire for anything else, including that which belongs to our neighbours. As the Apostle Paul put it, I have learned to be content with whatever I have. Moses then moves on to the statutes and ordinances that God charges Israel to obey. These rules deal with a wide array of matters, including war, slavery, tithes, religious festivals, sacrifices, kosher food, prophecy, the monarchy, and the central sanctuary, or church in our context. In case the commandments, statutes, and ordinances in God's covenant might come to seem like nothing but a burden to Israel, Moses reminds us that their primary purpose is to bless us. If you obey the Lord your God, he will love you, he will bless you, he will multiply you. He will bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground, your grain, your wine, your oil. He will increase your cattle and the issue of your flock in the land that he swore to your ancestors to give you. Obeying the covenant is meant to be a source of blessing, prosperity, joy, and health for God's people. Obedience to God's covenant is the overarching theme running through the book of Deuteronomy. As the Israelites obeyed, they received several privileges. Numbers stated they were a chosen people, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. They were a redeemed people. He brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery. The covenant of love stems from God's love for his people, based on his character and embodied in his covenant. It does not stem from the numerical greatness of the people, or any goodness that they may have. His love, therefore, must be returned by his people. They are a protected people. When all the plagues were in Egypt, they were protected from them all. God was always working for their good. They were a people in direct relationship with Yahweh. I will live with them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Such privileges brought responsibilities. First, they were to have no association with idol worshippers, not only spiritual, but no social, political, or business association. Further, not only were they forced to worship no other gods, but they were not to participate in any form of false worship. Full obedience to God was not merely expected, but demanded. And neither were the people to go after the riches of the world. Moses then warns of the arrogance that often accompanies prosperity. When you have eaten your fill, and have built fine houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then do not exalt yourself, forgetting the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The people were instructed to remember Yahweh, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, so that He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your ancestors. When we attribute our success entirely to our abilities and effort, we forget that God gave us these abilities as well as life itself. We are not self-created. The illusion of self-sufficiency makes us hard-hearted. Moses taught the children of Israel to observe the commands, expect the blessings, and occupy the land and claim the blessings. He described a land which he never visited personally, but has heard from God and the spies about the wealth and resources of that greenery land. It was a good land, a land flowing with streams and pools of water, with springs flowing in the valleys and hills. A land that has wheat and barley in season, vine and fig trees in and out of season, pomegranates. It has olive oil, honey, iron, copper. It lacks nothing. So Moses said, "Revere your God, for he has brought you out of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful desert, thirsty and waterless land with venomous snakes and scorpions. He has brought water from the hard rock, meat from the oceans, and manna from the heavenly places." In chapter 12, the people received the commandment, "Do not worship the Lord your God in the way these pagan peoples worship their gods." Heavily paraphrased, that's, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Worship is supposed to be different from what and how the world worships. True worship, according to Deuteronomy, is about coming to God wherever He is. He didn't want the people of Israel getting all mixed up with the cultures around them and going to their temples. He wanted them to make sure they were worshipping no other gods but only Him. Worship was about bringing offerings to God. The people would not be going to the temple to get anything for themselves, but instead they would go with the mindset of giving to God. Furthermore, worship was about celebrating and rejoicing who God is and what He has done in their lives. Everyone came to God, gave what they had, and thanked God for everything He was doing. The people joined together in joy and celebration. The temple itself was broken up into sections for different people to worship God. In the centre, towards the back, was a place called the Holy of Holies. It was separated from everything else by a hanging curtain. It was behind this curtain that the ark was placed, which was the sacred box where God's presence dwelt. It was only the high priest who was allowed to go into this place, and then only once a year. When he did, he would actually have a rope tied around his ankle just in case he wasn't spiritually clean and died. Walking out of the Holy of Holies brought you to the sanctuary where the high priest and other senior priests could go regularly. Not in God's presence, but pretty close. From there you'd walk out to the court of priests, then into the Israelites' court, which is where all the male Jews would come. The women had their own separate area, called the women's courts. That was just a little bit further away from God's presence than where the men could go. Then finally there was one more section that was the temple precincts, which was where any Gentile or non-Jew could go. So worship in the Old Testament was very hierarchical, in that God's presence was reserved to this one place, and depending on who you were, dictated how close you could get to God. The text moves on to the topic of generosity. I shall read a couple of verses, but from a modern version which I think adds a punch to the idea. If there is any among you in need, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your needy neighbour. You should rather open your hand, give liberally, and be ungrudging when you do so. For on this account the Lord your God will bless you in all your work. We become fully blessed only when we bless others. God gave many laws to the Old Testament people. Some laws pointed the Jews towards the Messiah. Other laws were more generic, applying to all humanity, and can be applied directly to us today. Still others were related to the running of the nation of Israel. The principles behind these laws can give us God's wisdom. Financial laws in Deuteronomy may seem very odd to us. For example, cancel all debts after every 7 years. Lend a lot but borrow nothing. No final land sales, since all property is returned to the original owner every 50 years. God didn't forbid debts, but debts were cancelled and indentured servants were freed every 7 years. Add to that the law that every 50th year was declared the year of Jubilee. In that year, all land was to lie fallow, and all property reverted to its original owner. God gave a promise to the Israelites if they followed his financial plan. The Lord your God will bless you as he has promised. You will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. As with every law of God, it's the attitude behind the action that really matters to God. God expects us to keep a tender heart towards the poor, no matter what. That's not always easy to do. Every law that God gives us is to help us fulfill the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. Remembering that everything we have comes from the Lord, we are pleasing God when we help each other, and he will pour out his blessings in return. One troubling topic in Deuteronomy is slavery. It's troubling because it's not really a concept with which we are familiar, but also because it just feels so wrong. Israelites became slaves to one another not through kidnapping or lower birth, but because of debt or poverty. Slavery was preferable to starvation. People might sell themselves into slavery to pay off a debt or at least have a home. The slavery was not to be lifelong. If a member of the community is sold as a slave, they work for 6 years, and in the 7th year they must be set free. Upon release, former slaves were to receive a share of the wealth that their work had created. Most significantly, masters are to regard slaves as equals in God's eyes, remembering that all God's people are rescued slaves. Moses also had instructions to pass on the subject of bribery and corruption. He said, "You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality. You must not accept bribes, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of those who are in the right." The prohibition is against accepting bribes, but not against paying them. Moses set up a system of trial courts and courts of appeal, and commands the people to obey their decisions. Both the priests and judges are essential to the law. He also made it clear that those in authority are not above the law, but must obey and uphold it. Neither should they abuse their power by enriching themselves. Deuteronomy requires owners of productive assets to employ them to benefit the community, but the community must not take advantage of their generosity. For example, the passage states, "If you go into a neighbour's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in a container. If you go into your neighbour's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbour's standing grain." God requires us to be open with our resources for those in need, while also exercising good stewardship of the resources with which He entrusts us. Everything we have belongs to God, and His command is that we use what is His for the good of the community. Differences of class and wealth can create opportunities for injustice. Justice requires treating workers fairly. Neither the poor nor the aliens or foreigners had the standing in the community to challenge wealthy landowners in the court. Thus they were vulnerable to such abuse. Deuteronomy gives several commands seeking to ensure honesty and fairness. For example, "Cursed be anyone who moves a neighbour's boundary marker. Cursed be anyone who leads a blind person on the road. Cursed be anyone who deprives the alien, the orphan, the widow of justice. Cursed be anyone who takes a bribe to shed innocent blood." Moses concludes with a third speech, a final appeal for obedience to God's covenant. Just one verse in chapter 30 summarises it well. "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity." Obedience to God leads to blessing and to life, while disobedience leads to curses and death. In this context, obedience to God means keeping the Sinai covenant, and was thus an obligation that related solely to Israel. Yet obedience to God, leading to blessing, is a timeless principle that limited to ancient Israel, and it applies to us today. If we love God and do as He commands, we find it the best plan for our lives. This does not mean that following Christ never involves hardship or want. It does mean that those who live with genuine holiness and integrity will do well, not just because they have a good character, but because they're under God's blessing. We are better off in God's ways than any other. The people of God were then told of a huge change that was ahead of them. Moses, the man who had led them through thick and thin for 40 years, makes a startling announcement. He says, "The Lord has said to me, you will not cross the Jordan." Just imagine the shock that went through the camp. He then adds, "Joshua will cross ahead of you." I suppose this is the biblical equivalent of "the king is dead, long live the king." Here was their leader talking about a change in leadership. At such a crucial period of planning to enter the Promised Land. Moses also added that he was no longer able to lead them, being 120 years old. It was obviously a scary time for the people of Israel, who were used to seeing Moses in front of them. However, Moses assures them that although he will not go ahead of them, the Lord your God himself will cross ahead of you. Twice he states the Lord your God goes before you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. And so Moses therefore tells the people to be strong and courageous, a statement he repeats 3 times in quick succession. This gave strength to the people, who were well used to seeing God go before them as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. At the end of his speech, Moses called Joshua to him and said to him in front of all the people, "Be strong and bold, for you are the one who will go with this people into the land." This was done in public, so Joshua has to acknowledge before the whole nation that he has accepted the duties laid upon him. The whole nation has to acknowledge that Joshua is Moses' sole legitimate successor. After this, Moses sings a final song and then dies. The song warned that if Israel will not obey the covenant, it would suffer terribly and will finally experience redemption by the mighty act of God. Joshua is not a last-minute choice. It is Yahweh himself who designates Moses' successor. Moses has long been preparing Joshua to succeed him. By the time Joshua takes over from Moses, he is fully prepared for leadership, and the people are fully prepared to follow him. God reminds his people that he is their dwelling place. Over them is his sheltering protection, and underneath them is the support of the everlasting arms. Moses' death is recorded in chapter 34, the very final chapter of these 5 books of the law, which we refer to collectively as the Pentateuch. Moses is taken up on an elevation to see the panoramic view of the Promised Land. He's standing and looking to the northeast. He's then shown the west and the south, looking at the coast of the Dead Sea. He saw the plains of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord reminded him that it is the land promised to his ancestors, but added, "I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." After seeing the land, Moses dies and is buried in the land of Moab. There was mourning for the beloved leader, and Joshua took over. Unlike Moses, Joshua needed help from others in order to know the will of God. He never communicated directly with God as Moses had done. The text tells us that Moses was even buried by God. Yet, looking back at his life, he was not that different from other humans. He went through so much hardship and failure. Yet Moses endured and overcame so much to win praise at the end. Like everyone else, he saw his share of failure and human brokenness. The life of Moses teaches valuable lessons when we feel like we are failing. We should pray. Prayer is not only talking to God, but listening to God. Those who have a prayerful spirit and practice are more resilient and can bounce back quicker than those who do not pray. Be gentle with yourself. Do not blame yourself or others. Rather, channel that energy towards correcting the problem. Talk to somebody. Do not try to struggle on alone. Forgive those you think may be responsible. Forgive yourself so that you can move on. Nobody is perfect. When we forgive, we are clearing our minds for good things to come in, and we're creating room to receive goodness. And learn to be resilient, since we have a God who never changes. Deuteronomy vividly portrays the fulfillment of God's covenant with his people. The overarching themes of the book are the need to trust God, to obey his commandments, to turn to him for help. To abandon any of these pursuits is to fall into idolatry, the worship of false gods of our own making. Although these themes may initially sound abstract or philosophical, they are enacted in concrete, practical ways in daily life. When we trust God, we give him thanks for the good things he gives us. We recognize our limitations and turn to God for guidance. We treat others with respect. We're honest in our dealings with others. We train ourselves to be joyful in whatever God gives us and not to envy other people. By God's grace, Deuteronomy is not at its heart a list of rules and regulations, but an invitation to a relationship with God. A living relationship with God is our only hope for the power to live according to his word. In chapter 10, Moses said, "O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." The book of Deuteronomy underscores the importance of God's word. It is a vital part of our lives. Simple obedience brings blessing, and sin has its own consequences. None of us is above the law. Even Moses, the leader and prophet chosen by God, was required to obey. The reason that he was not allowed to enter the promised land is that he disobeyed the Lord's clear command. A great way to keep going forward is to take some time to look back and see what God has done. We close then with a great quote from the book. "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, by holding fast to him. For this is your life, and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them." If you would like to know more, then please do contact us at any of the contact addresses given on this slide. Or if you're ever in the Radstock area on a Sunday morning, why not come and join us for our 10:30 service at the Baptist Church? You will always be very welcome.